Are you old enough to remember the assassination of President John F. Kennedy? I was in the 6th grade in suburban Chicago on November the 22nd, 1963, when the principal came over the class intercom to break the news. The kids were bewildered and scared. A lot of the teachers were crying. The moment is seared into my memory. That's the power of a national tragedy. Even today, visitors come from all over the world. In fact, 6 million of them since 1989, to the 6th floor museum at Dealey Plaza in Dallas, so they can see the place that police discovered the sniper's nest and the rifle of the assassin Lee Harvey Oswald. A lot of them like to look out the window and just imagine the trajectory of the bullets that changed American history. When our world is rocked by an assassination or a terrorist attack like 9/11, often we become introspective and reflective about our most basic values of hope, trust, and faith. Same is true when it's a personal tragedy. I know what it's like to get the phone call from the doctor where he says, "I'm sorry, but you've got cancer." I've been on the receiving end of a phone call that told me my dad had died prematurely. At that moment when our personal world is rocked, often the only thing we can do is ask the question, why? This isn't merely an intellectual objection. This is a heart's cry. We want to know, why does God allow so much pain and suffering in the world? We're going to continue in this session to talk about this #1 objection to Christianity. And we're going to ask another provocative question. Might God use evil and suffering for our ultimate good?
"1,600 years ago, St. Augustine wrote, 'Since God is the highest good, he would not allow any evil to exist in his works unless his omnipotence and goodness were such as to bring good even out of evil.'" Theologians and scholars have long pondered and debated this question. Does a loving God use evil and suffering to accomplish a greater good?
I don't know why suffering can't be compatible with God's love. People have this idea that real love rescues from all pain. I ask people when they raise that issue, I say, are you a parent? Do you have children? Do you feel that your love for your children requires you to rescue them from every bit of pain? Have you never let them struggle through a difficult thing on purpose for a good reason? Of course, there's an impulse to rescue our kids. We don't want them to suffer egregiously. But there are times when we know that it's appropriate to let them suffer in the circumstances for their own good, because a greater good is in view.
And we have clues in our own lives. I think almost all of us can look back at some suffering in our past life and say, while I was in this, I didn't understand why God allowed it. And it was a real threat to my faith. And now that I see that it made me stronger, I do understand it.
For more than 40 years, the lessons and struggle of growth through suffering have played out daily in the life of Joni Eareckson Tada. In 1967, Joni, a 17-year-old high school senior, severed her spinal cord in a diving accident, paralyzing her body from the shoulders down.
When I was first injured, I imagined myself as a kind of a human guinea pig lying there on my striker frame. I was doing nothing but eating and breathing and sleeping and really just existing. And I thought in here, you know, most people out beyond these hospital walls are going to college, getting married, having children, going to work. And I'm just lying here sleeping, breathing, eating. And I realized, oh my goodness, upon my life, all the truths of the human race are going to be tested. Is there a God? Does he care? What's the purpose in life? And if there is no God, then why not have my girlfriend slit my wrist? Why not take my mother's sleeping pills? Why not end it all? I mean, who can face a life of total paralysis? And somewhere in there, in my anger and frustration, I realized life's got to be more than just getting born and growing old and then dying. There's got to be a God who cares. We're too significant. There must be meaning in all of this. I don't think I would have asked those larger-than-life questions were it not for my suffering.
In the decades following her accident, Joni's life has been marked by extraordinary accomplishment. Through her artwork, music, books, conferences, and radio and television programs, she has inspired millions of people throughout the world. In 1979, she founded Joni and Friends, an international ministry that has taken the love and hope of Jesus to the disabled and their families. Through it all, she has intimately known both the pain of suffering and the presence of God.
There are a lot of people who think I'm a strong person, and I'm not. I am such a weak person. I wake up in the morning, and honestly, I think, oh Lord, I don't have the strength for this. I am so tired. I am so tired of this paralysis. But when I start to feel overwhelmed, I'll say, oh God, I have no strength for this day, but you do. I have no resources, but you do. May I please have your resources? May I please have your strength? I can do all things through you if you strengthen me. Please let me borrow your smile for the day. And honestly, before the morning has hardly begun, I've already got a perspective on the day. I've already got peace in my heart and a mission to accomplish. And it's because I've been pushed up against God. And God has shown me some deep things about his purpose and himself that, for me, are so satisfying, so pleasurable. I wouldn't trade the wheelchair for anything. To ask why a good God would allow suffering is to ask why a good doctor would put a needle in the backside of an infant to inoculate him. The infant doesn't understand it. All he knows is that it's horribly painful. He can't understand that, in a way, this inoculation is going to prepare him for something in the future that he's not even aware of. And in the same way, God is a God of intention. He's got a purpose and meaning. And everything he puts his hand to is brimming with intention and meaning. So we can rest assured that although the purposes for suffering might be hidden from us in this present life, his reasons are always wise, they're always specific, and they're always good.
Perhaps the supreme demonstration of God's use of suffering and evil for good was revealed in the death of Jesus.
Crucifixion was invented a few centuries before Jesus. It is widely recognized as one of the most horrendous forms of death that any state could sanction against an individual. It was so horrific that Roman citizens were not permitted to be crucified.
So it's no surprise that there is a build-up of the forces of evil, if you like, shrieking at Jesus, attacking him, criticizing him, until finally they nail him to a cross.
They came to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. There, 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "Save yourself! Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God." At noon, darkness fell across the whole land, and Jesus cried out in a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me?"
And he suffered, the Bible tells us, great emotional and spiritual agony because he experienced separation with his Father, and he experienced the actual sin of the world in his own conscious life and what it was like to feel and experience that evil and hurt.
It's the worst thing that ever happened. 3 hours of darkness. God himself dies. Inconceivable. Did God allow that? Sure. He allowed the devil to creep into Judas Iscariot and Pontius Pilate and Herod and the cruel Romans, and allowed the worst event in the history of the world. Why? For the greatest thing that happened, our salvation.
That injustice was redeemed by an all-wise, all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful God. He could take those kinds of things and he can turn them in to the greatest goodness imaginable, the salvation that would be available only through him.
And only when we see that in the light of the entire longer story do we say somehow this was how God, as it were, drew those forces of evil onto one place in order to defeat and deal with them there, in order to make a new creation, beginning with Jesus' resurrection. And that's why ultimately we have hope.
So an unspeakable evil was transformed into an unspeakable good through God's wisdom.
Jesus said, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die."
If it can happen on such a magnificent scale like that, if you can see in that one case how great evil can produce great good, if God lifts the curtain just a little bit so you can see behind the scenes there, it's at least possible to believe that that principle is at work everywhere.
This is so spectacularly wonderful that it gives us the hope that evil will never be able to be the last word about us, that there will always be a way of finding something good, that while the evil was still evil, it can redeem it and keep it from triumphing over us.
And Jesus answered, "I have told you these things, so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world."
That's a powerful statement. Jesus is acknowledging that because of the acts of humanity that open the door to evil in this world, we have pain, we have suffering. He doesn't try to cover it up. It's an inevitable part of life. And yet he tells us something else in that passage that's even more important. He says, "I have overcome the world." You see, we have real hope. Hope that's based on the central doctrine of Christianity. God became a man and entered directly into the suffering of the world.
When God became incarnate in Jesus, we are told that Jesus experienced the very same kind of heartache and suffering, without sin, I admit, but Jesus was finite, and he was subjected to thirst and hunger, to aggression, to hostility, to tragedy.
And when Jesus stretched his hands out on the cross, he was saying, "I love you this much. I love you so much it hurts. I love you so much I'd rather die than live without you." And those nails that went through the palms of Jesus went straight into the heart of God.
There's a wonderful hymn which we sometimes sing, which has a line, "And when human hearts are breaking under sorrow's iron rod, then they find that self-same aching deep within the heart of God." And that's a wonderful sense. God in Christ has been here. He has taken it. He knows what it's like. He is not unable to sympathize. He is on all fours with us.
I mean, Jesus was the most God-forsaken man who ever lived, so that he might in turn tell us, "I'll never leave you. I'll never forsake you." That tells me God feels, he empathizes, he cares about my pains. He felt the sting in his chest first, and that encourages me when I hurt.
In 1944, Corrie ten Boom, a prisoner in a Nazi concentration camp, considered the full measure of God's participation in the suffering of humanity. While clinging to life in the shadow of ultimate evil, she concluded, "There is no pit so deep that the love of God is not deeper still."
There's a famous passage in Elie Wiesel's book, Night, where he recalls being in a concentration camp and seeing a line of people being hanged, and a little boy is one of the people being hanged, and he's so light that he doesn't die immediately because his neck doesn't break, and he's dangling there half dead and half alive, and the crowd are being forced to watch this, and somebody suddenly says, "Where is God? Where is God?" And somebody else says, "There he is, he's hanging from that noose."
That's the answer to the question that's often asked, where was God in Auschwitz? Where was God in Darfur? He was there. He was in the gas chambers. Yes, the incarnation means that he descends into the whole of the human condition.
God is there at the heart of the mess and taking the worst onto himself. That's what we believe when we think about Jesus, and that's why ultimately we have hope.
It makes me feel there's a certain kind of kinship, that God gets it, that God understands. He's been there. He doesn't just have the facts straight. That's omniscience. He has entered into the experience of it, and that's something entirely different.
He knows exactly how I feel. There is no pain that I'm going through paralyzed. He was even paralyzed on the cross. That tells me he identifies, and that, for me, is enough.
The Christian response to the problem of evil and suffering was perhaps best summarized by the Apostle Paul. 2 decades after Jesus' death and resurrection, Paul described the persecution Christians endured and the hope that sustained them as they preached the gospel throughout the first-century Roman world.
We are afflicted in every way but not crushed, perplexed but not despairing, persecuted but not forsaken, struck down but not destroyed. Therefore, we do not lose heart, but though our outer man is decaying, yet our inner man is being renewed day by day. For momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison.
He refers to these things as momentary light affliction. What, Paul, are you crazy? Momentary light affliction? Well, we understand when we read further, because he goes on to explain that these are momentary light afflictions in comparison to something else, because these afflictions, and he's very particular about his words, are producing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. And you see, there's this subtle theme through the New Testament that helps us understand this problem of evil as followers of Christ. That God can cause all these things to work for good in our lives because we love Him, we're called according to His purpose. And these have a transforming impact on us so that when we get to heaven, we are actually different people than we would have been if we had not gone through these things. These momentary light afflictions are producing for us the eternal weight of glory.
If you only lived this life 80 and then you died and that was the end of it, the kind of hostilities and hurts that we have in this life would be writ large. Their significance would be stunning indeed. But from the vantage point of life forever with God in heaven, the harms and hurts that happen to us in this life, though still real and still important, are shown to be so insignificant compared to the glories and the joys we're going to experience in the afterlife, that from the vantage point of that perspective, they are well worth it.
In 1998, I was at a conference and met a young man named Mark Herringer. Mark was from Boston, and we became good friends. One night we were driving to the airport, and he told me about a tragedy that his family had suffered 5 years earlier. I'll never forget Mark's story because it demonstrated so powerfully the importance of what the hope of heaven can really mean.
It was January 16th of 1993. In Boston, it snows a lot, and so you're shoveling your driveway constantly. We had gone to the supermarket that morning, and while we were at the supermarket, it was actually snowing. So I got home kind of irritated and said, honey, why don't you park the car out in the street here? I'll just clean off the driveway. And our 2 kids were with us, our son, 3 years old, and our daughter, Lauren, who was 18 months old. I jumped out of the car, got a shovel, the kids jumped out with me, and I asked my wife to move the car to a easier spot for us to clean out the driveway, and she did, and she said, make sure you keep an eye on the kids. And my son immediately went with her into the car, and my daughter was with me for a few moments, but what I hadn't realized was that she actually wanted to be in the car also. And so as my daughter was running to the car, she was trapped under the front wheel of the car. There was a brief scream of pain, and I immediately ran out, and to any parent's horror, they see their 18-month-old daughter under the front wheel of a 2,000-pound car was overwhelming. She died instantly, as we found out later. I actually took the last breath that she ever breathed on this earth out of her lungs. And we drove to the emergency room at the hospital, hoping and praying that things might be different, but they weren't. And within an hour or so, they had pronounced her dead. I was very angry at God. I didn't know why he would choose me. And my mind would race and think, what is this all about? Where am I going? What does this all mean? Do I take my life? Do I go through a divorce? We had a 97% failure rate within the first 2 years when there's a death of a child and the parental involvement. What would that mean? Would that bring some closure to that? What would be a life of anger and despair at God? Those options are not good ends. The struggle during our pain here was I had to make a decision. Am I going to accept or reject this situation that I'm in based on not knowing the end game or not knowing all the answers? I was given a Bible, my very first Bible, on Christmas 3 weeks before the accident. And that Bible was to become the thing that kept me alive. There were drugs and various things that people gave us to try to calm us down during this difficult few weeks, but it was actually holding the Bible and reading it was the thing that actually comforted me the most. I actually slept with my Bible for about 9 months every night. What I was struggling for was the reality of Jesus, the reality of somebody who knew suffering, who was going to be there, who had experienced this himself. I spent a lot of time actually in cemeteries just walking around and found some comfort there. I could oftentimes connect more closely with pain there because I knew that everybody there had a story and that people had come and grieved there. It gave me a clarity that Jesus works powerfully in places where people are hurting. And so I found great comfort to just be quiet and listen to him there. And so sometimes I would just go around and read the stone markers and pray for the various families. And it actually turned from an internal thing where I was trying to get healing and hope to a place where I would actually intercede for others. And that was a shift that occurred where God began to do a work that my healing was going to be more complete in helping others. We had 5 neighbors who lived next to us, directly next to us when the accident happened. And within 5 years, 3 whole families of those households came to know Christ personally. And when I think back on where we were and how God used that, I said, that doesn't make it all right. That doesn't make it good. That doesn't make my pain go away. But it does tell me that God is bringing some good out of this, that there'll be some eternal good that comes out of her life and death. Your answer at this tough time is you are naked, you are stripped down raw. You have to make a decision. Which road are you going to take? Where are you going to go in your faith? And I think evil and suffering drive us to those points where we have to make those naked decisions. We have to make those raw decisions that give us nowhere out, nothing to hold on to. We're just there before Him. And that's what real faith, I think, is. Not knowing the future, but understanding enough now to make a decision that will change the future in our lives. If I look at it through my own experience, I think I would drive it to the point to say that God is in control of all things, and nothing is beyond His reach, nothing is beyond His ability to control. The joy is knowing that this is just temporary, that there's something much more. The eternal perspective changes things because it takes the focus off of my experience now and puts it in a different level, a different realm. The Bible says heaven will be a place where there's no more tears or pain or crying or death. Okay, so if that's true, then the hope is that these things will be resolved and that we'll understand. Or we'll have more clarity that we don't have now. The greatest hope is that one day I'll walk with her in heaven. She'll be perfect. And I'll be full of joy. And this life will have made a lot more sense. Because sometimes it doesn't, but I have that hope. Yeah.
Philosopher and atheist Bertrand Russell once said, "No one can sit at the bedside of a dying child and still believe in God." Now, on the surface, that sounds like a pretty strong argument against the existence of a loving God. But as Christian philosopher William Lane Craig has pointed out, what is Russell going to say when he's kneeling at the bed of the dying child? Too bad? I'm sorry? That's the way it goes? You see, as an atheist, Russell has nothing else to offer, because if there is no God, then we're all trapped in a world filled with senseless and unredeemable suffering, with absolutely no hope of deliverance from evil. But for the Christian, God does exist. Evil and suffering can result in a greater good, and there is hope and meaning for the future, because life doesn't end in the grave.
No eye has seen, no ear has heard, and no mind has conceived what God has prepared for those who love Him. The Lord is not slow in keeping His promise, as some understand slowness. He is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but for everyone to come to repentance.
suffering is in this world because sin is in this world. And if God were to get rid of sin, he'd have to get rid of sinners. I think he's delaying closing the curtain on suffering, sin, Satan, until more people have time to hear about the good news of Jesus. And if my being in this wheelchair a little bit longer provides the time and opportunity for others to come into the kingdom, then my wheelchair's worth it. My affliction is just light and momentary, and I don't mind waiting.
Now that offer of mercy will not be extended forever. There's going to come a time when he says enough, and then he's going to deal with it, and then true justice will be done perfectly. But this is not what we want, really. We don't want justice. We want mercy. And for now, mercy is what's being extended. And this is why you see the continuation of evil.
Dealey Plaza is where John F. Kennedy was riding in a motorcade when a sniper's bullet ended his life. In fact, the motorcade would have come right around me, taken a turn and gone down Elm Street. There's even an X in the road that marks the spot where the fatal bullet found home. Well, there's no question that the repercussions of this one act of evil just spread all over the world. It changed history. And yet, every time even a personal tragedy strikes, there are repercussions. There are effects that ripple through our lives and through our families. Yet I've learned in moments like that, my faith does not have to become a casualty. As we've seen in these last two sessions, we can still believe in God, even despite pain and suffering in the world. To me, the Christian worldview does provide solid answers that can satisfy our hearts and souls. In fact, when tragedy strikes, I don't want to run away from God. I want to run toward His comfort and His grace. Well, next time, we're going to talk about the second big objection that chased away the faith of Charles Templeton. That's the issue of how can Jesus be the only way to God? That should be really interesting. Can't wait to see you then.